Welcome, my name is Ryan Belikov. Today we're going to talk about human measurements or anthropometry. And so this area, really important to design. If you think about that ergonomics at first initiated really with the engineering regarding World War II on those bomber planes, right? And so they needed to change those to fit humans. And so that's why the military really took the lead on this. And so the US military, since that time, has had the most comprehensive database. And so the one I want to use for this lecture is 2012, even though they have a more recent version of 2025. I don't have clearance for it, so we're going to share that old one. If any of you have a military background, you probably can access the more recent one, but otherwise, I don't think things have changed that much. So what is anthropometry? So if we look at the Greek, anthro means man, metry is to measure, so the measurement of human beings, right? So it is very important to design for either clothing, equipment, cars, pretty much everything we use. And a key concept is fitting that job to the person versus the other way around, right? So we want to really central in. And so this is one way we can do that is take these measurements and change that workstation to fit the human. And so better decisions in design equals better productivity. So remember the things we want to optimize with productivity, health and safety, all of those. So the number one question when we're talking about measurements of humans, what's the best reference? So here is at 2012 of the military personnel. So we're going to have some examples all throughout this lecture. So some of the height, measurements they measure on here, and it gives, landmarks on here of where we're measuring, such as, it says for the calf circumference, we want to measure, horizontally, so across at the right calf, usually with a measuring tape going across, with the heels 10 centimeters apart. So, the amount of weight we put on our legs for our leg difference will matter how much we're flexing that calf, right? And that could change our measurements. So ergonomic improvements aim at fitting that person to the job. So lots of ways we can do this. I mean, we can look at the worker selection, screening, training. All of those are fitting the person to the job. But better ergonomic improvements in the work design is fitting the job to the person. And so think about human engineering, organizational change, and safety and controls. So this is definitely an example that will be on the test. Clearance of with when we're thinking about these measurements, what kind of things are we thinking about? Clearance is adequate design for the largest user. So this is also always on the CIH exams. So it will be on our exams. Think of a doorway. So a really tall person, you want to make sure they don't hit their head or exits access. So those are the things that you're thinking about for clearance. Reach, work design is usually that station. So you want to design it for the shortest person so they can reach without, having to bend and those type of things, making sure that those controls are available to that user. And then for posture, design for good posture relationships. So we don't want to design something that has a low overhead, so that a person has a hunch. So that's, common in those bombers. They were all scrunched up. just to perform, and we want a station that allows strength, so a design that allows optimal performance. And we've gone through some things, and there's some general guidelines. So if it's a little bit below, usually of level work surface, we can put more force, but we want it a little above the traditional work surface for more detailed work, so we don't have to hunch. So we all come in different sizes, right? And so that's why we need to take these measurements and determine what's the average is usually what we're really focusing on. So usually how we measure is these landmarks. So there's lots of landmarks that they use for human measurements, depending on what you're measuring and who's measuring it. Even though there is some consensus with the military, when you go through it, some of them are pretty vague, and there's lots of other organizations that have guidelines on how they're taking these measurements. So it's unfortunately not a very standardized. That's why we usually use the military, because they have more of a consensus of what they're doing, even if some of them are as detailed as we like. So taking these measurements does not need to be complex at all. So we usually just use measuring tapes, a flexible measuring tape to get like the circumference. These calipers here can get much more detailed of a measurement, but usually not as necessary. So, when we're taking the averages of these measurements, that standard curve that we're going for. So in the middle here, we have that mean. That first standard deviation, or the z-score, is that 1.645, if you kind of remember your stats. So the two measurements for human measurements we have the most data on is weight and height. And so height, you can see it says a person's height can vary 2.5 centimeters per day. If we go back to that back talk that we gave, remember the discs in there are filled with a gel fluid substance that goes in and out by passive diffusion. So that is one area that we could definitely change our height just with that disc either puffing up or losing its height. And then we have fluctuations with weight. So lots of things can fluctuate with weight. How hydrated we are is, an easy one. The amount of clothing, all kinds of things can influence weight and make it fluctuate. So, we have general scales that they say that, those balance beams that are actually pretty old school actually hold their calibration longer than some of our digital ones. So something to keep in mind. For the US population, so average person's height is at 5'9", and for a female at 5'4". Just give you general census of where the average height is for the US. Are people getting taller? Yes. So this is, a study that tracked people for 39 years, and they saw an increase from 161 centimeters to 163.1 centimeters. So people are getting taller, and I've seen tons of stats, even stats that go over a century, showing inches of height difference. So this is definitely a progression. And they theorize the main thing that's driving this is nutrition. One of the biggest height differences that they saw was in Korea. There was a big economic boom for Koreans, and they saw a huge height difference. So right now, if we look at the whole world, the tallest country is actually the Netherlands, and I believe, I think it was 71 inches, if I recall, if that's right. So taller than the U.S. For weight, so we're looking at males at an average of 200 pounds. Of course, when we're talking scientific, usually we're using that metric scale of kilograms, but we're just generally talking here. Females at 171 pounds. So definitely less, but just the general population of our averages is at the 50th percentile. For the head metrics, this is a common one, whether we're wearing hats or helmets or all those things, that circumference at uh, 56.7 centimeters. And notice that the females are more than almost a centimeter difference at 54.6 centimeters for the 50th percentile on this. And so if we go into this a little bit, the head has lots of different measurements we can take. I want to give you an example of 5. So this first one here is the head width or breadth, they call it. So at that 50th percentile right in the middle here, we see that females are at 14.7 centimeters, whereas the males at 15.4. So, that's that average percentile right in the middle. It's going to be that bell curve, remember. If we go from the, second percentile all the way to the 90th percentile, we really see a span of about 2 centimeters. And so we can use this as our, general guidelines when we're designing clothes, when we're sculpting, all of these things. So for other measurements, for the head example, but there's many more. We have the head length. We can do from the nose to the chin, from the ear canal to the top of the head. Notice that they have, different terms of that. With the head width and length, a lot of times they actually say if it's a female participant, include the braids, which I thought was kind of surprising. Um, but it makes sense because if you're putting a hat on, you want that head, their hair is still going to be there. So I think that's the main reason for that. And then this last one we have for a measurement is in between the pupil distance. So those are some examples. Again, lots of ways we can use these measurements. The clothing design is pretty straightforward, designing a hat. Some programs we can use, there's this ZBrush and Blender, both have a free version. So if you were trying to design a clothing for something, and there's clothing designers, right, that actually take a design architecture, and then you get a bachelor's in that. So this gets really complex. I would encourage you, if you were interested, that ZBrush is a little bit more straightforward. Blender allows you more access to different tools for free. And so that, you could design that head shape based on your measurements. So other example, more complex, Dr. Elliott, this was many years ago, but this is when, 3D scanning was just hitting the market to go over some of the helmet sizes. And so he was using Air Force pilots to help design their helmets. These helmets get extremely complex. I mean, the average costs like $30,000. I've seen them go all the way up to $200,000 just for the helmet. And they can weigh up to 20 pounds, which, really complex, but you think some of them that are going into space and those type of things, they need different breathing apparatuses and those type of things. So very complex. So also they can have, weapons, laser controls and stuff like that built into the helmet. So getting very complex. But this is, a study where they did these 3D measurements with the scanners. And, traditionally we did measurements with the calipers and those type of things. But they said, oh, they theorized that failed to capture the head. because there's a lot more to it than just those measurements that we're traditionally taking. And so when they looked at these pilots, um, they had some requirements. So one was to reduce the mass of it because more compression on the head would cause more discomfort. It wouldn't make them function as optimally. They had to consider the inertia of the helmet. So when they're going several G's, this is so much force, and then they add those G's to that. Not only are they carrying whatever the helmet weight is, it increases. So really hard on the neck. And then they also need to address how stable that helmet is with different straps. Comfort, even though you think, oh, these are, pilots, they just need to get the job done. But, often they're wearing them for a long duration. And so comfort can affect their ability to fly these airplanes, and as well as head protection, of course. If they hit their head on, something because they had to take an abrupt turn, we want to make sure those heads are protected. So this is the 3D scanner that they were using. Even though this was a while ago, they've definitely advanced, and this is one of the first uses of these 3D scanners. And so they could take a lot of measurements pretty much immediately. I mean, look at these 42 measurements that were taken within 5 minutes. And so very precise as well. So we're going to go over that. So they were proposing new methods to design it, to develop vectors from the midpoint of the head, align these with the helmet design. So this was a whole new way to design a helmet. And so they came up with this principle using component regression analysis. So let's take a look at that. So for sizing this helmet, they took the midpoint and going around with the circumference as well as the distance between to help fit that helmet. And so obviously much better design for the top of the head. So what they found is that the head sizing and design accommodates the majority of the people, but the variances were smaller and new sizing when comparing to the references. So they found value in using this new design for a better fit. So even though we've been talking about human measurements with a tape measure or a 3D scanner, human measurements also include strength. So how, a person can lift something, for example, so that's another human measurement. So if we take these averages, our maximum strength are about in our 20s. Usually they say 21 is our strongest, most dense our bones are going to be. And after 40 years old, they found a decline in how much we can lift things. So by the age of 65, almost a 39% reduction in our lifting ability and 45% reduction by the time we're 80. So ways we can measure human performance with these, trying to determine strength. We can do force contractions versus time. So oftentimes, this usually involves weightlifters. We're trying to, lift as much as we can in the time duration, or 10 reps, repeat 3 times. For research purposes, and exercise science, usually they say, your force contraction at 50% for 1 minute is one of the ones that are generally used. That 100% for 1 second is not generally used because it increases likelihood of an injury. So some things to consider with taking human measurements. People can have bad posture, and that can reduce our height between 5 and 10%. Shoes usually add about 1 inch. And then wearing clothes, wearing a hat adds about 4 inches. So different things to consider when you're taking these measurements. So this comes from the Bridger book, and so this is in your resources. But if you're interested in how to, basic template on how to design, we have 4 steps here. So one is to measure what that we've been talking about, our landmarks. So for example, our hand width related to the hand size. And then we're going to design for each of the pairings, determine the design. Can one fit fits all work, or do we need to take a percentile of that body measurement? So think of when we were talking about clearance, we're talking that, we want the 90th percentile for the height. Rather for reach, we want that smallest person. So we're going to use the female, and then go down to about the 5% percentile. So those would be ways we can design. And then the third step is combining all those design values to make a mock-up, put it in a modeling, whether we're using a computer program or actually hand drawing it. And then fourth, going back to that one size fits all, gloves, for example, we have usually a small, medium, and large. Pants, we have, different measurements for males and females. The same goes with chairs and shoes. So usually one size fits all is not a general guideline. Usually we have at least 3, if not a range. And so to calculate this is basic stats. So we have this mean, and then we look at the z-score and then the standard deviation. And so we can put those in based on those design calculations. So for example, if we were designing a Japanese tent, probably different than Americans, right? So we want, one of our problems we're trying to decide is how much height clearance do we give. So our steps is to determine the body dimensions essential for the design. So probably, bottom of the feet to the top, so the height. Determine the population to be considered. So again, that's kind of a clearance. So we're going to take the tallest, so which is usually male. Select the population to be accommodated. So we're at that 95th percentile for that tallest. And then we can do our calculations. So for these Japanese, we saw that the mean is at 164 centimeters. Our z-score is the same. Remember, first standard deviation is 1.64. Our standard deviation for this population is 5.9 centimeters. And so then we can apply that to this figure out our design, and what we come up with is a 5.9 for clearance for these Japanese. So same calculation, if we're looking at US, if we're looking at a storage container, pretty much the same thing as the tent. Actually this is a little bit different, sorry. Instead of the height, we're using the length for the shoulder height. So what we're doing is similar to that reach principle. So we want the smallest, and so we have the females, and so we're using the 10th percentile. So you could usually decide on this percentile. General guidelines is 5% and 95th percentile. Sometimes if you want a little broader for the smallest reach, we use 10. And so these are the calculations for that reach for the person's height at 4'2". So again, we can use drawings to calculate all of these, and we'll use this as part of our activity. Same thing with the sitting, tons of measurements we can use from the hip to going down to the ground, for example. For the height, we can use the width here of that seat span, all kinds of measurements. So these were more measurements for clearance. So, if we are wanting to make sure we have enough clearance for our reach, so these are examples of reach. And then this just goes through some other measurements that you could take. So we mentioned some landmarks, but these are landmarks as far as measurements go. So during this whole lecture, we've been using the U.S. military 2012. This is just one more example. There is other human measurements. This book you can look up for body space, it's called. I'm forgetting the company that did it, but this is just another example of how they use these measurements. And notice on here, they use the 5th, the 50th for the mean, and 95th percentile, and then they have the standard deviations. So you could use those calculations. All right, so that concludes our lecture on human measurements. It can play a vital role with design. Thank you very much.